Greenstein is the global head of AI and analytics at Cognizant, which is a major global IT services and software firm, working with tons of giant companies. Bret has extremely authoritative hand on the whole issue of what data can do in business and society. So Bret, thank you so much for being here. Really happy to have you.
Thank you, Dave.
You have strong views about how data can change society and drive growth, both for individual companies, but also for society as a whole. So just give us your big picture view to start on that.
Yeah, I think for many of us in the tech field, we were always driven by the potential energy of data. What could data unlock? What could it unleash? We've been talking about big data for years now. However, it was really during the pandemic when I think it became clear that data was not just necessary, but probably the only way forward to really get a handle on what was happening and to know what to do about it. I think every company right now is going through a major transformation, embracing data. We talk about being data-driven. That doesn't just mean using data and facts to make decisions. It means knowing what data even matters to your business or to society, how to bring it all together, how to bring meaning to it. It's probably the greatest challenge from a technology perspective because data is growing so quickly everywhere. And at the same time, data is so messy and so ugly. It's unstructured. There's images and video and text and social data. So I think the challenge is great and the potential is great. And that's why it's such an interesting time.
Yeah, I mean, when you have worked with a lot of companies that have a wide range of competencies in this area. When you work with, obviously you help the companies do the right thing. Companies that are really doing it right, give a quick characterization of what that kind of company's work would look like.
So, yeah. I think if you look back to the times of e-commerce, most companies focused on how to remove the friction from the buying and finding experience. How can you just sell things as friction-free as possible? But truly data-driven companies are thinking about how information flows freely in the enterprise and how it's in people's hands at the moment they need to make a decision and anticipating what needs are. I think of so many people who run businesses today who look at a monthly operations report and they sit in a meeting and they notice that their revenue is off or their products aren't working or their customers aren't happy. And then they spend, a lot of time just trying to figure out why that happened, what's going on. That is business for the last 30 years. However, really digital businesses, really data-centric businesses, they walk into those meetings and they already have the analysis. They have forward-looking predictions. They understand what's coming, why it's occurring, and they focus more on how they take the action, not trying to figure out what happened. So this backwards-looking operational thinking is traditional business. It's what we're all taught. However, data-centric people, they look at what's going on and they're looking for causal factors. What really drives change? What's caused that change? What do they do about it? How do they know what the best actions to take are?
I want to get into the work you've done around COVID with Oxford University and the XPrize, but before we do, I know that even in terms of just companies responding to market changes during the pandemic, you were disappointed in what was being done and that you think a lot of opportunities were missed. Talk about that.
No question, opportunity was missed. I think a lot of companies coming into the pandemic had been on a methodical path towards getting to cloud technologies and doing digital transformation, but it was a steady pace. And for those companies that had invested early, they had already built a data fabric for their business. And then as the pandemic hit, they knew where their stuff was. They knew where their customers were. They knew what things were changing. And they had a foundation of data that made them much more responsive to the change of the pandemic. However, so many companies were not prepared. And I looked at a lot of the behaviors of consumer-facing companies. It was the huge toilet paper shortage that occurred at the beginning of the pandemic that caught everyone off guard. And admittedly, there were not a lot of market signals that was coming because it was really an emotional response to just worrying about supply. However, shortly after that, you started to see spike shortages of various products. Flour and yeast were one huge shortage for a while that rippled through the country. There were leading indicators of that. They were all over the place. You could look at social media and see people talking about baking and sourdough bread and all this home care because they couldn't go to restaurants and couldn't get fresh things. the signals were quite obvious. However, most companies missed it. They understocked, then they overbuilt afterwards and stuck with huge supplies of things. The supply chain of the country became completely inefficient because people's behaviors changed so rapidly and no one was watching for signals. They were looking at historic performance.
So companies are too often looking at the wrong signals or not enough signals. And I know that you have a passionate view about the value of combining data from disparate sources in order to gain a richer understanding of the world operationally and predictively. Talk a little bit about that whole idea of sharing and how you think it could really change business.
The idea of sharing data sounds simple and obvious. We're all taught sharing is good when we're children and how we play. However, in business, we actually rarely do it. Most people consider their data to be a competitive advantage, to be proprietary, and to be something to be controlled. However, it's really the aggregation of data from different perspectives that creates powerful insights. About a month ago, U-Haul published a report about the migration patterns of people during the pandemic. They have a unique perspective on a certain market segment who likes to move themselves and where they traveled throughout the country every week, during the pandemic. That's a unique perspective that creates enormous monetary value. If you combine that with the real estate market, the information Zillow or CoreLogic had, combine it with mortgage brokers and what they're doing, the integrated view would have been very powerful for people to get a much more advanced view on those migration patterns, and perhaps people moving to states with incentives, for example, to be remote workers. You combine all these insights and you have enormous power to create value. And I think a lot of people are just missing the opportunity to do that because they're considering the data to be too proprietary to be worth sharing.
So that isn't technically impossible now, but it's almost never happening, both because companies are holding onto their data too tightly, but also because generally companies don't even recognize the value they could get by cooperating more. I mean, because presumably that value could go in every conceivable direction if a sharing culture were to exist. But do you so to pick up that up anywhere, any part of that, but do you think we will inevitably get to a much more sharing oriented business culture around data?
I have no doubt of it. You could start by looking at how much information we shared about ourselves, before social media, and what platforms and incentives encouraged us to begin to share in a way where we did relinquish a lot of privacy for the increased value of interaction and experience. Businesses are beginning to realize this aggregate value. Now, there's been B2B data marketplaces for a long time. They're kind of closed and proprietary and point to point. However, platforms are emerging, for example, companies like Snowflake, that enable data sharing across a network where you can control who sees it, and you could share across your ecosystem in ways that create value. I think the very interesting things ahead for us are going to be companies and business models that emerge from the aggregate view of data, the insights it generates, and really creating entire value from insight alone.
Yeah, I know you've called Snowflake sort of the Dropbox for business, and you see a time coming when in platforms like that, companies will be able to turn on and off spigots to various types of information, like say all their delivery information, but without giving the recipients any kind of ongoing rights. So that could be incredibly catalytic. Let's talk about what you did around COVID, particularly with Oxford. First, describe what you did with Oxford, and then let's talk about how the XPrize thing came along.
Yeah, and it's really this example with Oxford that I think inspires a lot of the patterns you see in business. Oxford did a phenomenal piece of work to begin to aggregate the data about COVID, not just the number of cases. There were a lot of sources of that, but they also curated the data from countries and then eventually states on all the mitigation policies we were all doing to try to stay safe. First, school closings, work closings, mask compliance, information campaigns, international travel bans, all of this stuff. They were aggregating it by scraping it out of RSS feeds and news articles and other stuff with an army of volunteers. Think about the power that existed from aggregating that data, making it available in a standardized data set from Oxford. And they did it because they knew that that data together would create more value. And then data scientists began to look at it and say, what could I do with that? We have a huge data science team in Cognizant. They began looking at that data and they realized there's probably correlation's the wrong word in data science, causation, causal relationships between mask compliance, social distancing, work closings, and the prediction of what's going to happen for cases in a given region. And they began to build predictive models on the data. What's really powerful about that is Oxford updated the data every single day from every country around the world, and then later states in various countries, including the United States. And then our data science teams were able to update a model every single day. And it was so telling to see what's going to happen in individual states and countries weeks and months in advance that we published it. There wasn't even a thought about monetizing it. We simply published it. We put it online, put it on the internet. We documented it in papers for people to see and diagnose and deep tear apart. And it just became something we felt very passionate about. And I remember at one point seeing ahead that colleges were not going to be able to open, that school closings had such an effect on the spread of the disease that it was unlikely schools were going to be open in the next 2 months. So I told my family members who were going to go to college in the fall, don't buy too much stuff. You're probably going to be working, studying from home.
Well,
Go ahead.
What's so interesting about that, though, is that to make it truly predictive, you couldn't just take numbers and feed them into a computer. You had to have people working to scrape and curate. It's almost like there's a new job category that you're suggesting needs to come into existence, which is like data analytics service professional or something like that, right? Where it's a nice thought because of all the possibilities that all this AI stuff would take jobs away. But here's a category where it really could grow. And so I'm just commenting there, but
well, I want to jump on that for a second because we have a Center for Future Work where we actually have described the emerging career paths that are coming, and people who do data curation, that's already a career. But even the ability to the cleanup of data that is now old and not useful, basically garbage collectors for data. There's so many roles that emerge from this because it's an asset that has a life cycle, it has currency, it becomes expired. Some of it is poor quality. There's a ton of work in the curation of data in the future. And AI systems rely on having good data. So it is a career path, and I think a very important one.
Really cool. Talk about how the XPrize thing came along then.
Yeah, so after we began to publish the work on our predictive models, we generated something that does prescriptive analytics. It basically looked ahead, it simulated what would happen if you changed your goals. If you wanted maximum safety, what policy should be implemented in various countries and states. The XPrize team got very encouraged by that because they thought, what if we could get data science teams from around the world, from other companies, from academic institutions, to start to innovate around this? So that we created a competition jointly with XPrize that looked at two things. One is, could they create better predictors of what's going to happen with COVID at the state and country level, using the data as it emerges? And could they prescribe better actions to take to help mitigate the disease? And on the prediction side, what's powerful about that is it was happening in real time as the pandemic was happening. We could also take those predictive models and roll them back in time and see how well they predicted where we are. So there's a quantitative way to measure whether they're good or not. And very, very effective predictive models came out of that. Some very, very accurate models that helped people to see what was coming. And then the teams that did best at prediction began to work on innovating around prescriptive analytics. This is running simulations to see what would happen if mass compliance went up 30%? What would happen if all international travel were locked down? What would happen if we opened schools? And they were able to see the various predictions, and there's millions of combinations, huge simulation, and they did this very, very efficiently.
And the winners were in Spain, and was it Croatia, someplace like Croatia, yes, or Slovenia, or someplace in Eastern Europe?
Yes.
It was a astonishing creativity, and you had a ton of entrants, and I assume that a lot of that work is continuing.
There is. So there were hundreds of entrants initially. 100 got through the first gate. 48 teams competed for that second part, and then 2 teams won in the end. But from all that, we learned more things. For example, the combination of models was actually more accurate than any one model. So we're beginning to look at how people could not just create a model, make a great model, but even how you might combine them over time to create more efficient ones. And also, we've begun to think as a team, what happens for the next pandemic? What should we be watching for in society? What signals matter? Now, there's business signals, like I mentioned before, about sourdough bread and baking and shortages in supply. That's business signals, but there's also tons of early warning signals on the spread of disease itself. how many people, for example, were taking cough suppressants or fever suppressants before they were tested positive for COVID? Would we have seen spikes in that? Should we be watching for things like that, where unusual patterns of people taking over the counter or other treatments might be indicative of something coming that we haven't tested for yet? Before there was a test for COVID, there were still sick people. How do we watch for them?
So you kind of have a macro theme in the way you think about this stuff, which is very combinatorial, maybe, or where you really believe that it's combining different algorithms, it's combining as disparate as possible data sets. That's where we're going to get the insights that drive business and society forward. Unfortunately, that psychology is not prevailing in business now, though.
It isn't. However, if you look at the world dynamics, one of the advantages that China had during the pandemic was a really complete and total access to data. So telecommunications data, mobile phones,
Right.
applications, you could see patterns of people moving around and where they're even moving past people who had possible infection. Access to that data showed a significant competitive advantage. And I think it's up to all of us now to look at how to safely share data. How do you share
Yeah.
data without violating privacy and compliance in ways that still generates value? I think the Oxford work was a phenomenal example, one that I think we should use and over to kind of reiterate how powerful it can be. But also businesses working together now in their own ecosystems are beginning to innovate around this. And many companies are trying to figure out how to move from creating value only with physical goods to creating value through the insights and information they generate. So I think the emerging business models of tomorrow will demonstrate this more and more. And I think the technologies that protect compliance, but also enable sharing, have a tremendous opportunity to crack that.
And you should put in a word. I know you have strong opinions about some of these data privacy laws that are either being already imposed in Europe and elsewhere and strongly considered all over the world, that there is a risk that could go too far in preventing some opportunities of this world.
It's a really tough balance. And clearly individual freedoms and privacy dominate the policies of most of the Western countries, and rightfully so. However, if taken too far, it literally means don't share anything for risk that it might be traced back to someone. And I think the further you go, the more you start to question whether you can even provide public safety with no information whatsoever. And so there was a balance that I think countries struck during this. There was a lot of debate about track and trace, for example. I think it was a good debate. I saw a lot of efforts in Germany discussing whether GDPR limited the ability to do track and trace. And perhaps if you go too far and you cannot tell where sick people might be, that's obviously a public safety concern, and I don't want to say overrides privacy. It never overrides privacy. It's just it has to be considered in balance with trying to protect individual privacy.
Interestingly, on Tuesday at this conference, we had someone from the Cleveland Clinic and the mayor's office at Cleveland talking about how they use geolocation to tie that to COVID diagnosis and identify even specific buildings where there was a significant outbreak, and then they would quarantine and do other things, and they think start doing sort of surge vaccinations in places they've geolocated as hotspots for COVID, which I thought sounded pretty advanced for what we've done otherwise, and right along the lines of what we're talking.
It raises those same concerns. There are quite a few companies who are working together using cameras, for example, to identify social distancing in buildings to see whether people were clustering together. That didn't trace individuals. It wasn't facial recognition. It was looking at patterns of movement in buildings to see whether people were clustering and still safe. And I think from a safety perspective, we have to watch for those things and use technology, but it has to always have checks and balances to make sure that you're looking at compliance.
Regardless of whether we can get over the privacy issues with individuals, this issue of businesses sharing is a separate, I mean, some of that data is personal, but a lot of it is just business data, right? And you have some interesting ideas that I want to end with on how we could induce businesses down the road to start moving in this direction of the sort of snowflake, Dropbox in the sky, sharing conceptual, driving insights forward collectively world. Could you just talk about some of those ideas?
Sure, and I'm going to go back to the example with China. China has a much better handle on the data in the country. Certainly, a lot of people generating a lot of data, but they have access to it. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to look at if there is, and this is an assumption, if there is greater economic value from the sharing of data, we probably have to find ways to incent the sharing of the data. And much like we use carbon credits to incent green behaviors, whether a company produces extra and sells to others, on aggregate, it's to move us forward to be a greener economy. I think we have to look at how data sharing credits and creating value is positively incented for companies. I look back to that example of U-Haul and imagine if
You mean like with tax credits or something like that?
like tax credits. If a company like U-Haul got data credits for sharing that information in a way that allowed the economy to grow because we had a better, efficient model of understanding the migration patterns of people and where real estate and other things might change, imagine how powerful that would be for them to share that, as global warming and other factors are causing people to move, and increasingly people are moving from higher risk areas for global warming. Those information creates economic value and economic risk. There's an incentive to share it.
So you could get government incentives, but you could also get companies trading with each other. So they gave each other credits, and I give some to you, so you have to give some to me. But you had another idea that involved just thinking about corporate responsibility here. So talk about that.
So the other thing that was very clear during the pandemic is there were some companies who knew a lot about what was happening during the pandemic from the data they had, whether they were a pharmacy or a retailer or a healthcare company. And there is an ethical responsibility at some level to share or provide information about what you know that might help and improve society. I think for companies that are working in AI and data, increasingly we're forming boards of responsible AI and responsible data. We run our own, we help companies set that up. It's a big topic because if you are sitting on data that could help the world and don't share it, that is only going to come back to hurt your brand, but it's also, part of social responsibility to really share that. And I know that that's not always in the economic best interest in the short term, but in the long term, those who knew something and didn't do something to help, obviously their brand will suffer as a result. And those who do help should get the benefit of getting effectively recognized for their corporate responsibility.
Well, you're clearly on the cutting edge of thinking about a lot of these issues, and I think most business executives are considerably behind where you are. So it's great to have you here talking about it. I think this is real. You pointed to a number of frontier opportunities if we're going to make a more efficient society, particularly in a 5G era where data proliferation is clearly going to be massive. So Bret, thank you so much for joining us. Really fascinating to hear you talk about it.
Thank you so much, Dave.